When my ex-husband, Mark, smirked across the defense table and whispered that I was wasting the court's time, I almost believed him. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Judge Sterling glanced up, froze mid-sentence, and slowly stood up from the bench, his face draining of all color. My husband's smug smile vanished into total, paralyzed panic. Look, if there's one thing I've learned from watching people tear each other apart in divorce court, it's that arrogance makes people blind. Mark thought he had stripped me of everything. He thought leaving me broke, isolated, and exhausted would guarantee an easy victory. He had no idea that a random flight from Chicago 24 hours earlier was about to destroy his entire life. Okay, so let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand how we got to that courtroom in the first place. If you're new here, subscribe. I post a new story every day. My marriage to Mark didn't collapse overnight, it eroded over 3 long years. I was 33, working 30 hours a week while taking care of our home, while Mark ran a mid-level corporate logistics firm. At first, he was just distant. Then came the subtle put-downs, the financial hiding, and eventually, the classic, "you'd be nothing without me," speech. When I finally caught him transferring shared savings into a private account, I filed for divorce. His reaction wasn't anger, it was amusement. He hired the most ruthless litigation firm in the city, an outfit known for burying spouses in legal fees until they settled for pennies. The day before our final financial motion, I had to fly home from visiting my sick mother. I was exhausted, holding a carry-on, and sitting in economy on a packed, delayed flight. That's when an elderly man named Arthur sat next to me. Now, here's where I'd have lost it if I were in my normal headspace. He was struggling to lift his heavy vintage leather bag into the overhead bin, and people were literally walking past him, sighing and checking their watches. I stood up, helped him lift the bag, and offered him my aisle seat because his knees were clearly bothering him. He looked at me with this quiet, incredibly gentle gratitude and said, "Kindness is rare when everyone is in a hurry, young lady." We spent the next 2 hours talking. I didn't spill my entire personal life to a stranger, but I admitted I was flying back for a very difficult legal hearing the next morning. Arthur listened patiently, nodded, and casually mentioned he spent his life working in administrative law and teaching at the state university before retiring. He was wearing a slightly worn blazer, drinking plain black coffee, and carried himself with zero pretense. When we landed, he handed me a small card with his name and a landline number on it. He said, "If your morning gets overwhelming, just remember that people who rely on intimidation usually do so because their foundation is weak." Have you ever met a complete stranger whose words stayed with you long after they walked away? Let me know in the comments below. Fast forward to 9 a.m. the next morning. I sat alone at the petitioner's table in Department 402. My court-appointed legal aid attorney was running 10 minutes late due to traffic, and I was trembling. Across the room sat Mark, wearing a tailor-made suit, laughing quietly with his lead attorney, Mr. Vance. Vance is a guy who looks like he practices his intimidating scowl in the mirror every morning. Mark leaned over, looked directly at my empty attorney chair, and mouthed, "Good luck." I felt my stomach drop. I was terrified. I felt completely outmatched, underfunded, and hopelessly outgunned. Then, right at 9:12 a.m., the courtroom doors creaked open. I turned around expecting my frantic legal aid lawyer. Instead, in walked Arthur. He was wearing the same slightly worn blazer, holding a simple manila folder. He smiled softly at me, walked past the gallery bar, and pulled out the chair right next to mine. I leaned over and whispered, "Arthur, what are you doing here? You don't have to be here." He just placed a calm hand on the table and murmured, "I had some business in the building. Mind if I sit?" Across the room, Vance, Mark's high-priced attorney, snickered out loud. He looked at Arthur, leaned over to Mark, and whispered something that made Mark chuckle. They thought Arthur was some confused old relative I brought for emotional support. Mark actually shook his head and smirked like he had already won. Wait, read that part again in your head, because the utter arrogance of this guy was unreal. At 9:15 a.m., the side door opened and the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sterling." We all stood up. Judge Sterling walked out, a stern, gray-haired magistrate known for being absolutely brutal to unprepared attorneys. He shuffled his papers, adjusted his glasses, and looked out over the courtroom to begin reading the docket. Then his eyes landed on our table. He stopped mid-sentence. His hand hovered over the gavel. The color literally drained from his face, and his mouth stayed open for a solid 3 seconds. Without saying a word to the clerk, Judge Sterling slowly stood up from the bench. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The court reporter stopped typing. Mark's attorney, Vance, looked up from his iPad, suddenly confused. Judge Sterling gripped the edge of his podium, looked directly at Arthur, and said in a voice heavy with shock and deep respect, "Dean Calloway. I had no idea you were back in state jurisdiction." I gasped. I sat there staring at Arthur. Arthur didn't flinch. He just gave a polite, dignified bow of his head and said, "Good morning, Arthur. It's been a while since you were in my constitutional law seminar. I'll be honest, I didn't expect what came next." It turns out, retired law teacher, Arthur was actually Arthur Calloway, the former Chief Justice of the State Appellate Court, former Dean of the Law Faculty, and the literal co-author of the state's Marital Asset Distribution Code. He wasn't just a teacher, he was the mentor who had trained half the judicial bench in the city, including Judge Sterling. Vance's face went from smug confidence to pure, unadulterated horror. His pen slipped right out of his hand and clattered onto the hardwood floor. Mark glanced frantically at Vance, whispering, "Who is that? What's going on?" Vance turned to Mark, his eyes wide with panic, and hissed, "Shut up. Shut your mouth right now. Would you have stayed calm if you were sitting in that room watching your ex's lawyer completely fall apart? Let me know below." Judge Sterling cleared his throat, quickly regaining his composure, though his demeanor had shifted entirely. "Dean Calloway, are you representing the petitioner today?" Arthur stood up smoothly, placing his hands on the table. "Not as counsel of record, Your Honor," Arthur replied calmly. "I am here as a friend of the court and pro bono advisor to Mrs. Whitney, pending the arrival of her counsel." Arthur then reached into his manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. However, while reviewing the preliminary financial disclosure filed by the defense last night, I noticed a rather concerning irregularity regarding offshore corporate holdings in the Midwest Logistics Registry. Mark literally froze. His jaw dropped. You see, Mark thought he was clever. He had hidden $2 million in a shell company using a legal loophole he read about online, assuming my legal aid lawyer would never catch it. He didn't realize he was sitting across from the man who literally wrote the statutory precedent closing that exact loophole 15 years ago. Arthur hadn't fabricated a single thing, he had simply spent his evening pulling public registry filings using the corporate name listed on our joint tax returns. Vance immediately jumped to his feet, stammering, "Why, Your Honor? The defense was not made aware of these supplemental documents. This is highly irregular." Judge Sterling looked at Vance over the top of his glasses with a gaze cold enough to freeze water. "Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling said, his voice flat and cutting, "if Dean Calloway suggests there is a non-disclosure issue in a financial affidavit in my courtroom, you will sit down and listen very carefully." Vance sank back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. For the next 20 minutes, Arthur didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists. He simply spoke in a measured, quiet tone, pointing out 3 specific statutory violations in Mark's financial submission. Every time Arthur spoke, Judge Sterling took detailed notes, nodding in absolute agreement. Mark sat there sweating through his custom suit, looking at his lawyer, who was staring blankly at the floor, completely defeated. By the time my legal aid attorney finally burst through the doors, breathless and apologizing, the entire momentum of the case had changed forever. Judge Sterling ordered an immediate full forensic audit of Mark's company, froze all disputed accounts, and held Mark's legal team in warning for bad faith disclosure. When we stepped out into the hallway after the hearing adjourned, Mark rushed out, pale, trembling, and furious. "What is this?" Mark yelled at me, his voice cracking. "Who did you hire? How did you pull this off?" Arthur stepped between us, looked Mark dead in the eye, and said softly, "She didn't hire anyone, son. You spent years convincing her she had no power. You just forgot that power isn't measured by a bank account. Mark stood there, unable to form a single sentence, while Vance dragged him away toward the elevators to figure out how to avoid severe sanctions. Arthur turned to me, smiled, and asked if I wanted to grab a cup of coffee downstairs. Looking back, that day wasn't just about winning a financial motion in court. It showed me that arrogance builds a house of cards, and it only takes one small act of genuine human kindness to bring the whole thing crashing down. When you treat people with respect, whether it's on a crowded flight or in everyday life, you never know whose life you're touching, or how that kindness might come walking back through the door right when you need it most. What do you think of Mark's reaction when he realized who Arthur was? Did he get what he deserved? Drop your verdict in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. I post a brand new narrative every single day. See you tomorrow.